Hello and good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to be here and to introduce the speakers to that seminar. So for this workshop, we have invited Dr. Kalyaraisan, who is assistant professor at the MIDS, and who has also a position at Brown University in the US. This is maybe the first time that we have host a guest from the MIDS, which is the Madras Institute of Development Studies, a large multidisciplinary center run by the ICSSR in Chennai, and incidentally the place where I started writing my PhD some year back. And what also is quite exciting is that we are going to talk about a book that has received wide publicity ever since it was published, maybe a year ago, or just February. Was it February last year or April? So not even a year ago. So the book is Dravidian Model. I have a copy here that I will circulate. In fact, we have two copies, several copies here. And this book was written by Kale, but also by Professor Vijay Bhaskar, who is also from the MIDS, and who works now for the government in Tamil Nadu. The book is important because it's about your unique trajectory of Tamil Nadu's social and economic and political development. And that's something that's not very obvious when you're sitting in Delhi, is the fact that certain trajectories, especially socioeconomic trajectories in South India, are really very distant from what we've seen in North India. And another thing that I would like to stress is that beyond the book, which is a research of academic, a product of research, of academic research, it has been used and discussed and mentioned by lots of people ever since, including by people who have not bought the book, I'm afraid. So I'm sorry for Kale and his, copyright, because it has become also how would I say, the way the new government in Madras, in Chennai, has decided to portray its unique political intervention. And now a lot of people are talking about Dravidian model by referring simply to the current DMK government, whereas as Kale will tell us, it has a much longer history. And I'm also happy to have Professor Veena Naregal from the IEG, from the Institute of Economic Growth, who is a specialist of Maharashtra's cultural history, among other topics. And I'm sure she will give a broader regional perspective to the discussion of Kale's book. So thank you. And now I will give the floor to Kale for about 40 to 50 minutes.
Thank you, Christophe, for such a generous and detailed introduction, and Professor Henry, Professor Odile Henry, and Professor Veena Naregal. Thank you all for having me here. And also it's little, I'm also little not so nervous when my professor has come to listen to me. It always gives me a little of privilege, and I'm really honored and humbled to be here. And this acquired, the Dravidian model has acquired certainly as become a kind of household name in the state and beyond. And in fact, I would say the term acquired its own life, which I have, or even the originally what we thought about it, or the way in which we defined it might be quite substantially different, though. But it acquired on its own life. So before getting into the definition aspect, what this book or the work tried to addresses two very specific questions, which are important not only in Indian context, also very important largely to the global South in particular. One, we all know that the spatial location decides the human well-being today. It's like in the sense that it is rural, urban, or a region, or in broadly which poor region, rich region. Within nation state, you can have a huge range of variations in the well-being, particularly country like India, which has a diverse history and has a relatively degree of regional autonomy, or you say as a state autonomy, and as a huge variation in terms of developmental indicators. Then the question arises, this is generally among economics and political scientists to address this question as to why certain regions grow, or even the growth is being little broad-based as compared to other regions. Is as to why. Is it historical reasons or other reasons? That is something has been the economics and political science been occupied addressing this question. The second question again, which is connected to the first question, is as to whether the social identity of individual matters in deciding the well-being of people. And also the connected question is that in what occasion, what condition, the mobilization against status-based or the social identity-based discrimination become developmental. Because you can have a situation where the mobilization take place against social discrimination, but does not necessarily translate into a developmental outcome. So this books try to address these two questions, looking at a specific state in India, which is called Tamil Nadu, and it's mapping its almost 100-year political economic history in a way. I mean, it's economic history explained by political and historical variables. So the main argument with respect to the region, we know that it's very well documented in Indian context. There are certain regions do well in growth, in particular, say, which it became, in fact, a big debate in 2014 election in India. It also turned out to be a debate between two great economists, or the two divide within economic thinking, which we call as a Sen's versus Bhagavati, which is, you can translate into a kind of state Kerala versus Gujarat models. One actually gives more emphasis on the social development through which you achieve a growth or, capital accumulation, or the other is more of you have a growth that actually translates into certain mechanism into a broad-based development. And we do see here clearly, though, with empirical evidence, well documented again, Gujarat, Maharashtra does really, the both states do really well in certain growth indicators. But if you look at its social indicators, particularly health and education and broad other social indicators, not correspond to that growth rate. It's nonetheless they're better, but not correspond to the level of economic growth. Whereas Himachal Pradesh really indeed did well in school education. Remarkable. Recent time, I think no other state has comparable with Himachal Pradesh given its geography, and did really well in school education particularly. But you don't seems to be having a broad-based industrialization. Uttar Pradesh seems to be not having either of this. So given this diverse trajectory of Indian states, you seems to be Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Kerala, to some extent, Tamil Nadu, but certainly in this, in a relative sense, seems to have combined both growth and development. In connected to this second question, We also have a caste mobilization based on, because I said the social identity matters in the individual well-being, and you have a mobilization in North India, particularly in Bihar and UP, in other states, on the caste-based mobilization against caste inequalities, discrimination, but has not translated into outcome. But in that case also, because the history of Tamil Nadu partly is shaped by the caste mobilization, anti-caste mobilization, seems to have done relatively. So what condition and why that actually in certain state it happens and not in other states? I'm going to explain this having Tamil Nadu history. Here, even definition comes to the picture. What is actually the Dravidian has to say? Why does it matter? Why not Tamil Nadu model? If I say the Kerala or the Maharashtra, here is there's a conceptual greed to understand the political and social history which led to this developmental outcome. Here I take, although we trained in economics, we mobilize some resources from political scientists in particularly to explain why, at what context, in a divided society, you can have a public goods. This is well again documented by political scientists. In a divided society, it is very difficult to have a public goods provision, particularly in the education and health. So in Tamil Nadu, given its political, I mean, or any other state in India, we all divided by caste. So you need to have a common identity, which you call as an umbrella, as a term here is a Dravidian, which according to us, I mean, the historical mobilization, the imagination of the Dravidians are much contested. But one thing comes out very clearly here is that it is an identity meant for mobilizing diverse caste groups who are positioned at the bottom, broadly, called as horizontally placed. I mean, there are vertical, within that there are relative position ups and down and hierarchy, but still in a large way, it actually was able to, this term was able to mobilize a diverse caste groups and an umbrella identity called as a Dravidian. How that mobilization was done, there's an historical reason. I mean, we can take from Gramsci and, there's a long literature on it and what way the mobilization can take place, subjective forces, political context, alliances, but broadly it did take place of mobilizing a diverse caste groups under one umbrella called as a Dravidian. So that identity was initially as a social mobilization. Over a period of time, it got translated in electoral scene and institutionalizing certain policies or certain policy interventions. Before getting into that, what is this phase from the social to the political and in getting electoral? There's a long process, which again, get insights from people like Laclau, who actually theorized as a left populism in the Latin American context. Why that matters? Because we are not a country where like a kind of very large working class politics happens. We lead the working class and bring the intervention. It's a very like a underdeveloped or developing country. You have diverse identities. So you need to have a common platform, a common way or connecting. So he provides a very theoretical resources as to how do you build diverse groups bring them into together with as a elaborate mechanism chain of demands, in the sense you collect look at their differential demands and identify a mechanism through which a slogan which connects all of those demands and bring them together. That's you call as a Laclau's in a way. You need to have a certain mechanism. You need to have a common enemy or that kind of interior exterior. There's a long explanatory framework. We can go in detail, but in one line, it is a way mechanism through you actually collect diverse groups, classes, caste into one identity, which actually push towards electoral mobilization with a certain mechanism. That electoral mechanism brought in when we map the state policies, we divide into two set of policies that institutionalizing that comes with the electoral success, particularly beginning with the DMK, but it does not confine with the Dravidian political parties alone. We even try to emphasize in the book, even anybody operates in that space, in that political space, essentially have to deal with certain political and economic question. Particularly, we even call as a common sense with related to the reservation debate. It has to, anybody who wants to participate in that space electorally or otherwise, have to agree with, or that's a predominant opinion, that the cost-based reservation matters. That is actually one way of inclusion. And certain level of anti-caste discourse one has to accept, one has to move beyond that. And caste really matters in even the public debate in terms of not just its identical question, it is deeply rooted in the economic question. So that there is certain level of common sense purely built by the political labor through the mechanism that I am mentioning, which institutionalize certain we call as a economic popular and social popular. This two intervention we call as a broadly two kind. One is we call as what political scientists call as the programmatic interventions. In the sense, political parties, of course, when it comes to the election, promises to certain policies to mobilize the poor. In Tamil Nadu context, we say not only that way, there is also a vision built-in, which is not necessarily articulated through the political leaders, but there is a certain, this social mobilization and we informed the political parties to intervene certain key intervention in the economic domain, in particular and social domain. One of those is the right-based intervention. You call as a reservation, you call as a strengthening the entrepreneurship from the local, provision of education, provision of health, certain thing which you call as a programmatic intervention. There is an economic popular which we call as a electoral tide or the patronage driven. There's a populist leader, the particularly MGR and Jayalalitha who can think of as a patronage driven welfare which tied with the electoral cycle. Every cycle you come out with, giving a new kind of what we today would Modi, the current prime minister called as a Dravidian culture, which is called as a populism. But in Tamil Nadu context, it's much more deeper. And this too, what I call as a electoral driven economic popular and programmatic driven right-based intervention are not two analytical, two distinct modes of intervention, but both are actually tied, in fact, mutually reinforced, setting up certain welfare intervention architect in the state that has a direct relevance to the specific or the developmental trajectory Tamil Nadu took. So let's go one by one how this mobilization intervened in the key aspects of developmental domains. So let's begin with the primary education domain. So we all know, it's again well-documented literature in India, particularly if you follow the old debates of the 50s and 60s debates of why India underfunded its education domain, particularly the primary education. This was actually main concern. Even if you compare with its level of per capita income with the most other developing countries, probably India was at the lowest in terms of provision of not only share of expenditure, even the level of expenditure. The share here, I mean, is the disaggregation of the educational expenditure. So this is actually well documented again by Myron Weiner, who actually wanted to study, is a political scientist from MIT. He was actually concerned as to why India, which came with the promise during the freedom movement of building a national building with the idea of expanding freedom and opportunities to its masses, but did really do very poorly in education, particularly given its child labor. He actually interviewed most of the scholars, politicians and the planners, particularly those who are concerned with first initial planning. And he came to this conclusion that there is an elite bias in understanding of planners. That elite bias actually was the cause, according to him, is the reduction in the public expenditure. Particularly, he says there's an expenditure increase in higher education at the expense of primary education. Even provides a number from, say, the share of the primary expenditure for primary education for 59% or 58% exactly, came down to be 34%, which is for a country which, given its literacy at 11%, is huge. So why was actually this happening? According to him, this is clearly driven by some kind of, it's not called, you call a structural thesis in a way of the elite at that point in time, or felt, or this is a conscious decision that's open to the debate. How much the planners directly or their caste class positions responsible? But the fact remains this happened. But similar thing, if you look at the Tamil Nadu case, you see greater level of expenditure put on primary education. That was thanks to Kamaraj at that point in time, and around the mobilization, which pushed definitely much expansion, much am I okay? It was on.
Can you hear better now?
Yeah, I think we should take this one because we have a program with the This does need to be read?
It's okay?
Yeah. You can unpress the top one.
Unpress.
Yeah.
Thank you. So if you look at the corresponding expenditure pattern in Tamil Nadu, you clearly see the large emphasis, the huge emphasis on primary education, and it also shows in numbers in 50s. And almost by 60s, you have schools levels, infrastructure is laid. I mean, particularly the infrastructure at level of school. Of course, we have a different set of questions. That kind of infrastructure came in if you look at the All India trend only with the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which is actually for it came into 2000. Although it was enshrined in our constitution, the primary education till 14 supposed to be given, it's all put in the directive principles, but that never took place across India. I mean, Kerala was exceptional in that way. Of course, Himachal Pradesh is exceptional in school education, but Tamil Nadu is actually similarly following Kerala trend. By 60s and 70s, your school education was taken care. That actually provided a base. By expanding DMK coming into power in 60s, and it expanded school higher education, particularly in rural India. By 80s, privatization also contributed largely because the certain elites who emerged from this mobilization also started, opening up colleges. But there were different political economy of that. But all of this actually made possible of the substantial increase in both school education and the higher education. Today, you have a GER almost 51%, which is in fact, it's one of the highest, I think the highest in the country, if you look at for the major states. And the next corresponding state is Telangana, which is 10 percentage point difference. And even there, if you see a relative degree of, again, social inclusion, thanks to the reservation policies. This guy, the policy makers in the state, for range of reasons, have actually innovatively tried, reservation expanding as deepening as possible, in the sense subcategorization within the communities in the OBCs, within the communities in SCs, and they also tried non-social, which is non-caste deprivation too, through the rural-urban interventions. A range of way they tried include as many students as possible in the expanding higher education situation. So one level, you increase your the emphasis on the primary education, and that building up later higher education was done through in a gradual way. And the bureaucracy also some way all contributed in terms of implementation of certain schemes. That again has a connection to, again, same pattern, because the expansion of reservation also allowed the bureaucrat come from the first generation or from the diverse background. That also brought its own life experience in implementing certain schemes. But it also has a serious implications of other aspect, negative aspect of it, which is corruption, other thing we can go in detail. But here in this case, certain innovative schemes to function, this social diversion or social inclusion worked in its favor. In education, we did achieve, you can go most of the indicators, you see clearly that kind of inclusion, both in the level and also of the rate. So this was actually also the case if you look at the health domain. Health domain, in fact, more remarkable. In fact, World Bank study has come out with a couple of reports to show how some of the public health department, or the way in which the public health department was constituted in India, in Tamil Nadu, actually was really relatively good, and some of the aspects can be even implemented in other contexts, can be emulated in other contexts, because it worked well. So the again question is, why did it work there? This is again well documented among the health economists. There was an elite bias in our education health system. In the sense, again, the tertiary care was actually focused much more than the preventive health care or primary health care. And in Tamil Nadu case, it goes to all the way to the Justice Party bringing in Public Health Act. Then later in the post-independent post-independent context, it was actually institutionalized, in fact, much expanded. That public health system also was connected to the reservation policy. Other kind of incentive structure was ensured within that public health system to ensure not only it covered across social groups, it also covered rural, in the sense there's an incentive was built in for the social professional, particularly doctors and others, to go into the rural India if they do certain level of, if they want to get certain incentive to get higher education, I mean, MD and other programs, promotions, range of incentive structure was built in. So this is definitely in contrast to what was happening in the similar time in other part of the world, particularly when focus was more on the tertiary sector, particularly high-end curative healthcare. So if you look at any indicators based on the physical infrastructure, health infrastructure by primary health population, primary health care by population, or the instruments, a range of physical indicator, health indicator, you see clearly state has done that. I mean, better. Why of that it happened? Cumulatively, it was built there. So in a way, you have a health capacity clearly in place. That health capacity building goes long history and also is a product of this molecular intervention at the different period of time done by the policymakers. In one more caveat here, even this is clearly shown in the out-of-pocket expenditure, particularly if you look at the public hospitalization in that sense, is clearly you see the relatively inclusive story there in the state. But it's one of the lowest, the expenditure expenditure incurred on hospitalization story for public accessing the public sector hospitals. So this is done thanks to, again, of the innovative model of what you call Tamil Nadu medical board, Tamil Nadu medical system, which actually buys a drug policy. There's a certain way they streamlined or centralized a certain mechanism of procuring drugs, and they ensure that it is free of cost at the public hospital. So clearly you have one level of the intervention in the domain of healthcare, and also intervention through reservation policies of getting the doctors and the health personnel from the diverse caste groups. This together worked as a relatively accessible health system that gets reflected in a range of indicators, not only in the outcome. You see IMR, MMR, and TFR, for life expectancy. You can clearly, I mean, I'm not showing the data here. You can clearly look at that indicators and show this state does relatively well. And the outcome was possible because of this range of intermediary variables. I'm not showing here of those data, but that's a mechanism, the process through which this outcome happened. And here I need to say this intervention in health and education, which I call as something particularly for an education context, can be thought of. I'm using here in the book and also in other writings, what I call as a capacity to aspire. This I take it from Arjuna Padre as an anthropologist. This is a definition why this matters, the capacity to aspire. This again, I look at some of the anti-caste literature or the literature from subaltern historians who come out with this story, that where in a context, if you say, when you have acute kind of deprivation, the intervention may come from immediate needs like a food and clothes and other stuff. But to make population, in using Amartya Sen, if you want to expand the building the capacity, enhancing the freedom, requires much more non-material resources too, in terms of dignity, social life, awareness, that kind of. So that mobilization also came along with this discourse against anti-caste or ideological level attack on caste, also came along with the provision of material resources through the health and education. So the expansion of freedom, expansion of capacity is a twofold. One is a non-material through the ideological driven, mobilizing masses through you change the discourse, try to change the social norm and make poor and subalterns, eligible or even can aspire to certain domain which was not available for many. So for instance, take the case, what do you mean by a capacity to aspire? For instance, there's in literature, it shows that, I mean, the contested evidence, but tries show that there are certain caste groups were historically excluded acquiring education. And it was sanctioned, socially sanctioned not to get education because that's your fate and that's your divine, sanctioned by the divine order. So some of those ideological barrier to acquiring education, acquiring access to the modern institutions were broken by mobilization. along with supported by the intervention in the material way through the health and education. So simultaneously this is happening. This simultaneous intervention in one level of ideological attack on the inherited inequality, particularly caste-based ones, and the expansion of material through education and health interventions facilitated many of them become entrepreneurship, even in the capital, domain of capital. So as a result, you see a degree of inclusion of entrepreneurs coming from deprived background, particularly from Dalits and the OBC. So much so, the latest economic census 2013-14, the 19 has not been released. 13-14, out of certain category, one out of four entrepreneurs among Dalits come from the state, which again is an outcome of this cumulative intervention done in the domain of health and education. So along with, if you look at the ideologues, again, question comes, some of the left intellectuals, others would question whether the Dravidian mobilization is against capital, or is it a socialist, or because many of them use the slogans of socialism or etc. But when I look back detail, look at the correspondence, look at their party documents, I don't get the sense that they really operating in that typically Marxist literature of anti-capital sort of sense. I think what I see is there are two trends clearly emerging among the Dravidian ideologues with respect to capital. They were not against capital. They were only for kind of capital they want, which they felt if it is a rent, according to them, the certain money lending capital they thought is a rentier and it is not productive enough. It doesn't help the state regions to grow. And the second, they wanted more people from the subaltern background into the domain of entrepreneurship. It is not, therefore, I would say, the development not against capital, it is with capital. It is, in fact, demanding the entry for diverse caste groups into the domain of capital. And because they actually even try to, here is the Dravidian ideologue, even some of the leaders who actually were instrumental are putting forth certain demands, they were clear. One example I'll give, the founding member of Nadu and the Periyar, the other one was an ideologue head in that. The Nadu was clear in his argument in the parliament, 1962 speech in the parliament. He was actually invoking southern Italy and the northern Italy divide to show that's how it looks like the southern states are actually been penalized. He wanted more factories and more allocation in the resources. Unless you do it, then we will end up the situation that the northern Italy and the southern Italy, almost invoking Gramsci in it, because Gramsci actually developed a lot of theoretical frame with that southern versus northern Italy debate in the Italian context. I think similarly, you see an articulation happening in another provincial state in India. So it's clear there was very clear argumentation, articulation of the demand for more capital penetration, particularly for the different social background groups, particularly who come from the at the bottom of the social order. And there were also another thing, it's very clear. They were actually, again, ideologue at the Periyar's insights on caste. He was actually trying to theorize that in the question, there are certain born capitalists, because there are people who actually was, according to their literature, their conception, it is in India, the caste privilege also is a born privilege. It gives inheritedly capital in some ways. There are certain people who are inheritedly good, the gifted skills, because there is a clear caste and capital connection. So therefore, he felt it really requires the active intervention, not only from the material provision, education, health, that actually prepares people to be modern sector, even if one wants to be entrepreneur. Also the questioning the ideological basis of it, that, the only certain people can become entrepreneurs. So they were operating this lenses. So that actually gets articulated as you go detail policy. But again, only one problem you have here is the economics. Again, would say, where is the evidence? How you actually make connection from the literature articulation in the speeches or even the assemblies get directly translated into a policy outcome. This is how do you say one-to-one connection? What is a regression analysis? Or I don't have enough evidence for that. But what I can say is, if you look at the policies, the institution was the build at this different point in time. Say expanding I can provide you. This actually provides you the. I would actually divide the state industrial phase into four, which is a colonial time and the post-colonial time of the planning, which is 47 to 67, then 67 the DMK coming into power to 90s, and the 90s the post-reform. And you clearly see in this phases, at the different point in time, the policymaker instituted or brought the intervention in the domain of capital, particularly expanding either through the regional wise or supporting the small scale entrepreneurs or supporting even the what Marxists call or the development economists call the transition story, the how to mobilize resources from agriculture to non-agriculture, or the people who are actually successful in agriculture to move to the non-agriculture, facilitating that kind of transition from rural to urban or from low caste to from certain peasant to small peasant to the entrepreneurs, or even the artisan route of transition of the entrepreneurs. So for that, they were actually already laying the foundation at a different base. So that was taking place at, I would say, from 47 to, sorry, particularly to 67 to 90s. That's the period DMK coming into power and expanding this infrastructure. This initial level of expansion of infrastructure in physical sense, in terms of laying road or connectivity, and you can actually, I provided the measures actually of the transport index and by standardizing with the population, by spatial, and also even the ownership pattern, and all clearly you see the expansion of those period. And the physical, the social intervention, particularly education and health intervention, both actually almost actually made it ready, looks like by 90s when the economy opened up, there were a lot of opportunities coming. This guy jumped into taking advantage of the economic reform that opened up by 90s. That actually clearly gets manifested. Say, if you look at the automobile sector, you can look at the sector-wise intervention there. Either you take the automobile, which is the one of the base, and which again, I can provide you evidence from ASC data. If you look at the organized factory sector in terms of the share of workers or in terms of share of capital, you clearly, even the GVA, this is GVA level, it is relatively lesser than Gujarat and Maharashtra, but fairly does well in the state. By not only that, even if you take the IT sector, again, you see the relative degree of penetration in terms of, take the output or even the employment. There, I have to make one more evidence. Again, this is from the migration pattern who actually enter into the software industry. Probably the state alone, some extent, one can say Karnataka, some extent, as a software engineers who, the studies suggest who actually migrated to the US in particular, other countries through the software and IT industry. You see the people coming from diverse caste groups. In other region, you will find maybe from the elite in certain background, but in the state, you see the across spectrum. You see that the relative, that actually some ways an outcome from the long process that I am describing here. So these are all certain evidences to show outcome, but the process actually has a very long history. So clearly you see the post-90s, the state, and this you can also check with the growth rates and also the share of Tamil Nadu growth rate with the All India growth rate, and also other indicators widening disparity. This is all well documented. Again, post-90s, the regional disparity in India has widened, and there are richer states, better states actually took advantage of the opportunity that opened up by the economic reform. So why that happened is because of this intervention made before 90s in the range of domains that I'm talking about. So is that resulted into a better labor, cost of labor, in the sense of the workers? This is where actually very interesting the dimension that I got through the ASC data. I looked at the data, whether this growth rates and the claim of the inclusion also we see in the domain of say workers' condition. Is that case that they compromised with the workers' condition or the labor question at the expense of expanding the reservation or the social questions? So normally we tend to see the debate, right, between the left and who actually talks about caste, actually confined to the question of social rights, but or not talking too much about the workers' condition. But I guess interestingly, Tamil Nadu also seems to be, which is again as a interesting. We know the share of wages coming down all over the world. The GVA, what economy usually measure gross value added, but Tamil Nadu too is coming down, but relatively still it is much higher than the other developed states, Gujarat and Maharashtra. And I did a field, and also you look at the union density. Again, the bargain that actually is the indicator of the collective bargaining of the workers. It is relatively higher, still the ruling density. Then it lets me to classify the mobilization of the workers in the state or the labor mobilization, which I try to call as a social left versus political left, which I to take this category from Richard Sennett, another sociologist. He defines, you can have a situation in a context where workers are mobilized with the other identities, but they get a better off. But that does not translate to vote in terms of votes into the usual traditional left parties. You get a better bargaining power at the worker level. As a worker, you get a better bargaining power, even if you align with the left. But when it comes to the electoral scene, you tend to vote for the different. And also vice versa. You also, since you support that non-usual traditional left in the electoral, that also gives you support when the worker situation or the collecting bargaining reaches into a kind of what you call as a impasse, in the sense, there's a contradiction. And definitely you tend to get a support from the local politicians or even the ward members. Or a clear example, this actually happened with me. I did a field work among the union members as to is there any evidence to say that the collective bargaining power of the workers here is relatively better than the other states. I asked the business, how do we measure these indicators? They gave one example, which actually they compared with Maruti case, which actually clearly the clear example of the bargaining power of the workers in Tamil Nadu with the vis-a-vis with the other context. Take the Haryana in this case. So when the Maruti workers issue was happening in Delhi, in Gurgaon, is a huge issue here. And there was a lot of violence and a lot of, mobilization was happening a long time. And there seems to be no support from the political parties, not even discussed in the state assemblies in Haryana, for instance. And in the similar context, there was a similar situation in many places, particularly where the automobile belt is strong, where the factory densities are strong in regions in Tamil Nadu. When I interacted with the union leaders with the clear evidence, they suggest that this can't happen. Here also it happened, but within third day, it has to have a discussion has to take place in the state assembly. Nobody can escape. No politician can escape from not participating, confining this is the issue of the factory between the labor and capital. It is not to suggest always the politician sided with the labor. No. There are all situations they sided with the capital too, but there is a possibility of engagement. The political atmosphere or the political situation cannot be insulated from the workers' mobilization, which I therefore tend to call as a embedded labor. In the sense, you have a union that can function or have an ability to bargain in a given context. So that actually worked because that, even objectively measured in terms of the unionization, rate of unionization, number of membership, and clearly you see, and also outcome variables also you see clearly of the degree of contractualization and the share of wages. But not to say that's all still withstanding, but some of them are actually coming down now. There's a pressure. Obviously, there's a limit that the subnational state can maintain that autonomy, given the labor laws when it's made flexible everywhere. It is difficult to maintain that level of insulated protection, but there has been historically, because of this mobilization, it is not from the elite benevolence, it is also mobilization, but workers themselves actually got this, the tactics and strategy to get this. This is happening in the domain of formal labor. But even if you look at the informal labor, again, the state seems to be doing an innovative intervention, which I call as a labor boards. It has some 17 sectoral labor boards, so the different, starting from the construction worker, the weavers, and the fishermen, and which actually Kerala was a pioneer. And two occasions, particularly even late 70s and the early 80s onwards started. In fact, I was surprised, one of the first unorganized board committee document, if you take, it exactly matches some of the articulation we see in the NCU debate in the late 2000 when the UPA came and they instituted certain policy interventions for unorganized labor, and see the articulation that this growth that we witnessing or is going to happen is not going to solve the problem, because there was an understanding that the informality is a residual category. Through the modernization, we are all going to get a formal sector. But seems to be here an understanding that there is an active separate intervention required for the informal sector. So that again, there too, if you talk to, there's a union I interacted with and also do detailed interviews with them, some of the activists or the trade union working among the unorganized workers, they say it is not the benevolence from the elite alone. Of course, the politicians were responsible, but also the mobilization also taking place. It's a both way of simultaneous push from the below, particularly from the workers' side, and also making politicians accountable to it and ensuring at least establishing some of this work sport, which in fact preceded what we see the national level intervention that was taking place in late 2000. So I see clearly an intervention, active intervention in the labor, both formal and informal. Even if you look at the rural domain of rural, again, Tamil Nadu is not the great experience to suggest that it has actually a relatively better land reform or anything, but definitely Kerala and Bengal does really well in that sense. But some recent studies suggest that they call as a de facto land reform, in the sense, they don't know, when the parties with the certain social base, particularly DMK and emergence of DMK in late 70s, actually pushed the local landed elites to move, or to at least ensure the rights of the tenants, and even to an extent there was a collective bargaining with the landlord to ensuring the basic rights. They call as a de facto land reform that gradually also resulted in the shift of the land to largely to the low OBCs, but less to the Dalits. But in certain region, particularly in the southern region, Dalits too have gained through this, what you call the de facto mechanism of the land transfer. But of course, the direct, the de jure land reform that did not happen as much as happened in the case of Kerala. But you see clearly this actually was again well documented by village studies. There are, we will right, Palanpur in North India, in the Tamil Nadu also there is a village studies cluster. And that actually over a point in time, you clearly see this house ownership of the land has been shifting from the landlord, which largely call from upcaste to the intermediate caste, and again to some extent Dalits in certain pockets of the region. So clearly the land is moved in that way. And the rural wage, if you look at the wages, again, which is targeting specifically to the non-farm laborers, non-farm work laborers, you clearly that also seems to be high. Why that is high is partly because of what I call as a intervention in the welfare domain, particularly the PDS. Why the PDS story is very important. The PDS is an important component of the welfare architect in the state. One example why it's very important, it's not only today is one of the in terms of penetration, in terms of coverage, also of the basket of goods that go into the PDS system is much more wider, in the sense, much more extensive in the sense of commodities from food grains to even household goods. Some of the household goods, provisions, range of provisions were included in it. So that definitely put I would call as the reserve wage high, and also put a premium in the sense is the additional kind of tap up to your wages in that sense. It's clearly pushed up the wage level. And this became very important, so much so when you look at the consumption expenditure data 2011-12, roughly it's much higher. I mean, I don't know the exact percentage I can show you. It actually very substantial component of the consumption pattern of the share of the PDS is very significant share in the average per capita expenditure in that sense. So it definitely worked in favor of the particularly poor, even if you divide into quintiles. And that became very political question too. When all India level, you had this question of targeted versus with the TPDS was introduced. Tamil Nadu also went to the targeted in post-90s. Then there was the by-election, the political parties who were in power lost election. And they had to come back that to the universal again. They can't go. I mean, they'll have a selected goods now to the targeted versus the universal PDS, but there isn't a commitment to you can't compromise with that. So this again is not intervention, as I mentioned from the above. There's also a pressure from the below, which actually made some of these policies acquiring a path dependency can't change. And it has its own problems, because once you introduce some of the policies, later if you want to shift or withdraw because that matures, and maybe you need a different set of requirement, it become difficult, but yet it worked on the ground. So in the rural case, you have a degree of land reform through the other means, and you have a welfare intervention that supporting the laborers and also pushing up the wages rate. And all of this actually changed the social relation in the sense, in the rural in particular. And if you see the many of the political mobilization from the elite or from the dominant caste clearly were upset with these interventions, because it's substantially going to supporting the, making it the previous corrupted people, it generated corruptions, people are not working, that kind of anecdotal, a lot of that kind of messages, that kind of articulation that we tend to hear is largely because it worked. And you clearly see today, if a structural transformation question is one of the agriculture workforce is less than 20, less than 30, it is 26%. If you look at the latest data, it's nowhere, all India rate is 44. If you take the share of agriculture in terms of workforce dependency, and even within the agriculture household, large part of income come from the non-agriculture base, and also this intervention, some of the interventions really worked at transforming. One of the urbanization also is huge. I mean, the sense, the estimation, 2011 estimation is 48%. If you look at latest figures from the government, it shows some 58% is today, as of today, 2019, if you take the cutoff. And even that urbanization also is well distributed, in the sense it's not come from a small town, the big town driven. It's largely the towns are coming from wider base to it. And that actually connected to the kind of intervention that I was making, like of the inclusion from the social base, and also the differential route of transformation from agriculture coming into industry, or the artisanal caste coming to modern sector. This made the small town become a part of the larger urbanization story. This transformation, both intervention at the domain of health, education, and the infrastructure, all of this actually made clearly a better transition or a structural transformation, and also with the degree of social development. So there we can certainly say, in that sense, the state has clearly made progress with respect to broad-basing growth and also development, which are relatively inclusive, both spatial and social. But where is that end now? What are this fresh challenges? This transformation also brought a fresh challenges today, which I would call as a shift, or maybe as a call as a second generational reform in that sense. Reform in the sense, this 100 years mobilization through political and social, through this intervention, definitely ensured a degree of inclusion in accessing the modern sector, education, jobs, and health and service. But it has brought a serious problem of what I call as a quality of life, in the sense the soft aspect of development, which is you call as a, get manifested in the range of ways. Particularly if you take the education domain, you clearly see your enrollment ratios, your school retention rate, a range of way, one give all the indicators. You see quantitative wise, the state seems to be relatively doing good, but there's a serious problem in terms of quality of those outcomes, particularly learning outcomes in the schools, and clearly the new forms of inequality coming into. In the sense, what school one goes decides what college one goes, and that decides the pathways of even job market, in the sense, that clearly, even in the same college, the different social background actually still shapes the possibility of getting the jobs, and well-documented stories on that. So you have a new forms of inequality. Some way I would call, as Professor Kundu once mentioned, of the urbanization of poverty. The poverty is being exported from rural to urban. I would call now the inequality is being exported from rural to urban. In a way, new kinds of segregation is happening in urban domain, new kind of informality that again shaped by the old cleavages. But not to say that it has not the current, the intervention that took place for last 100 years has not sorted. Definitely, it's relatively better, but new forms of challenges coming up that gets clearly articulated in the domain of caste too. There's some caste actually gained at the expense of others very clearly. And there's also a serious problem with the ecological crisis. I would call as this source of the discontent is the main discontent, main source of the problem as of now. And clearly, if you look at the government school, share of the government school has hugely come down from 76% in 1 decade itself, from 2012 to 2020. So that means a lot of people actually push to the private schools. Again, that quality of those private schools are not same, in the sense huge standard variation. That differential quality of the schools going to shape the kind of inequality we're going to get in the labor market. And similarly, you also state privatization of healthcare. See, as I say, the great things about great intervention done by the state with particular to the primary healthcare, still remarkable. If you do go to any remotest village, you clearly see in a primary healthcare with the basic amenities. I was actually shocked. A friend of mine was from Bengal. He was a student, ex-JNU student. He was doing a PhD in Chennai, went to the local doctor, the public primary healthcare, with no evidences of him, like any local ID card or something. Clearly, you see, with the fever, you get a direct, without with a few minutes, you get in the blood report with all the machineries in place in the primary healthcare. You can also find the same machineries in the primary healthcare even in the remotest village, but not to suggest all of them are working. Again, there are serious problem of its functioning. And the state also was a pioneer in terms of setting up what I call as a template of corporatization. The Apollo was Apollo was instituted in Tamil Nadu first. It tested its corporate model of development. So some way you see the private and public here seems to be in tension, but going along together. So how long, which will overtake what? But as of now, this is the trend and it seems to be working. And quality of life, particularly in terms of governance, there are serious critique in terms of top-down, bureaucratic-driven service deliveries, because it's a targeted, the chief minister or the policy, the politician decide, or even the centralized authority decides how much intervention have to happen. But that is a very, very push top-down quantitative aspect with less participation from the local. So local in the sense governance, in particularly Panchayat and other domain. That seems to be a serious problem with respect to the governance. Again, with the privatization of the education, you see there is a clear capital interest here, particularly certain caste gained from this mobilization, who also started putting colleges. That actually there's a nexus happening between politicians and those private colleges. As a result, Tamil Nadu is one of the figure. If you look at Tamil Nadu is one of the highest in terms of share in getting private loans. That again, going back to the same cycle. Somewhere here, there is a clear political economy of privatization and education, where a certain section going to benefit. With respect to gender, although if you look at the national level debate, you know that women participation in labor market has been declining. Tamil Nadu to no exception. But if you look at the levels, 10 percentage points is differ. Almost it's much higher, and also it's much more diversified workforce. I would certainly think of that it's relatively women gained in the labor market, but that increase in the participation in the labor market or even the diversification in the modern sector came with the degree of violence against women, which is some of them seems to be very normalized. NFHS data clearly suggests. So you see what is happening here is a reproduction of inequality in different way. And the soft aspect of development is missing in that sense. It's clearly, but in a relative sense, it's certainly been expanding the opportunities or ensuring access to the modern sector. But there are different set of problems that are emerging very clearly. That actually now we need to take up, because the moment we say all of this, we will be missing the other part of the new challenge that is emerging, that clearly became visible, the range of ways and the mobilization that takes place. And the state also was actually pioneer in terms of what the scholars, Walton and Caprice calls as a exemplary case of crony populism, in the sense there is a rentier coming from the natural resources, and that link with the political patronization or institutionalized way of corruption, all of them actually working, and which clearly actually pushes up of the quality of election, or quality of, if you call as a democratic functioning, because the per capita expenditure for election per candidate is much higher in the state. So which again directly connected with the same, I would say, the democratization of bureaucracy, democratization of the political life, also connected with this question. So we can't take that, look at only one aspect. Most importantly, there are two external challenges which going to shape whether this model or the degree of development that the state has seen, or the degree of as a degree of autonomy in terms of shaping a regional level or subnational level development possible. One, which is I would call as the limits of modernization itself, because given the global economic architect today, and well documented again by Danny Roderick and others, that we are going to have a situation where the rate of disposition, in the sense we are not going to create enough jobs, even whatever mechanism one follow, to absorb people released from the traditional artisanal or traditional agriculture sector. The word modernization of theory of the transformation seems to be very bleak and difficult. Maybe it can include certain people, but not all. So I try to say that, think of this in a way of the rate of disposition is much faster than rate of job creation, which we clearly see, even despite a state which has a wider manufacturing base. The state manufacturing base in terms of share in output or share in employment is relatively much higher, but even then it is not able to absorb labor release from the traditional sector. Second is the most important, given the political conjuncture and also the way in which the federal structure working. It is really putting a pressure on the state ability to do on its own of the kind of intervention that used to do. Not only of the education. Education, we all know it's now, for a long time, it has been in the concurrent list. And even the health, which is a state sector, but the kind of intervention that is happening now, state are increasingly losing its ability to design its own policy of intervention. It has to now tout-tile the pan-Indian thing, and also kind of intervention institutional way that is happening from the center is range of ways that is really shrinking the ability of state. Almost the state organs becoming an instrumental agencies than, or innovatively thinking, creating any policies on its own. Because if you look at this, many of the successful policies of the India today, we think of, take the employment scheme, which came from Maharashtra. Take the PDS, it came from Tamil Nadu. If you take the local governance, it came from Karnataka. So many of the successful schemes that we see the national level are tested from the regional level. And now that seems to be being difficult now, because the way in which the changing architect of federal structure definitely affecting the regional ability, but also you can even look at the fiscal resources. I'll just give it three variables. I'll end that with that the ability or the future of any subnational state that includes even Tamil Nadu, to possibility of following or pursuing this relatively autonomous path. One, look at its TFR rates and look at the southern state in particular, and look at its size in the larger population share, and look at its GDP, GSTP put together, and look at its share over a time. Obviously, then you look at the devaluation share in the total transfers. And all of these variables put together, clearly there is a new mismatch is happening that is going to create huge challenges. And that challenge is going to decide whether the ability of the subnational state to pursue the kind of policy, kind of pattern of development that so far we have been having. And Tamil Nadu case, this autonomous path with the specific unique history of social mobilization that translated into a political outcome with the coming of the power, that actually institutionalized through the policy intervention has certainly created a degree of development, degree of inclusion, and through what I call growth and development. But its future lies with the following challenges. I'll stop here. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kale. That was, I think, a brilliant summary of the book, but also stressing really some of the most challenging dimension of Tamil Nadu's situation today. So at this point, I will give the floor to our colleague Veena Naregal for our discussion.
Thank you so much, Christoph. Thank you, Kalai, for that, very comprehensive sort of coverage of all the empirical richness and detail that, your work actually sort of contains. So it's kind of made my work, much simpler, because I think I'll sort of focus and concentrate on, things that you've been relatively modest about in the presentation that you made. I'll highlight, what to my mind, as someone who kind of has come to many of the issues that, economists have always studied relatively late as a sociologist. So the fact that, this kind of a dialogue and this kind of a perspective that is emerging from, two scholars who have actually sort of have their primary training in economics, and this dialogue is possible. That itself, I think, is a measure of the contribution and the sort of openness with which the questions have been approached. But I'll sort of try and elaborate that more in my remarks. So obviously, congratulations sort of due to Kalai and his colleague and co-author Vijay Bhaskar for this highly significant understanding of the Dravidian model of development. I find this a highly engaged, innovative, and ambitious study. And therefore, it's no surprise that the CSH should actually think of, want to organize a discussion sort of, focusing on this particular book and find it necessary. I was told that, the topicality and the relevance of the Dravidian model, the fact that, the term has kind of several thousand links now in Google News and so on, is a small indication of the relevance and the topicality of the book and of the discussion that's happening today. So let me try and place this study in terms of the previous discussions and work on the Punjab model around the Green Revolution. I'm just sort of flagging that there is a body of work on the Punjab model around the Green Revolution or on the Kerala model, highlighting positive outcomes on several human development indicators, right? Partly emerging from that work, we also recall the public debate around the Kerala versus the Gujarat model that between Sen and Bhagwati that Kalai also alluded to. And that debate was about arguments on the choices, outcomes, and merits of development trajectories pursued in those states, and what it has meant for enhancing human development and social democratic possibilities, right? But I think it's important to emphasize that the scope and concerns and the implications of the argument presented in this work run analytically far deeper and are far more wide-ranging and therefore far more productive in striking out to break new ground. The Bhagwati-Sen debate was as much about development choices as it offered an implicit commentary and critique of the underlying political implications or even assumptions and objectives being advanced through the development strategies being pursued by those respective states, right? So we did have questions of democratization being assessed in relation with respective development strategies pursued in Kerala and Gujarat. So this sort of, this tension between democratization and development, there's from within economics and in political science too, Partho Chatterjee's sort of earlier work on planning and the connection between planning and democracy, and the carving out of that sort of enclosed enclave within the state that's interested to planning, making for the very sort of legitimacy of both the political project and of course of the entire sort of the political project of modernity, as well as the political parties, the state establishment, it's all sort of coheres around development. So there is that longer kind of trajectory. But the earlier debate between Sen and Bhagwati was largely between two divergent perspectives within development economics. And of course, it did generate a wider, an interest in a wider audience, extending well beyond the confines of the specific subdiscipline. However, the terrain of that debate did not explain the distinctiveness of a specific model of growth or its achievements with respect to the many questions of region and specificity of its cultural formation. I think that is something that, Kalai and Bhaskar's work has been sort of actually bring to center stage. And and the embedding of the development project in Tamil Nadu in the socio-historical dynamics at work across the sub-regions, right? So this kind of a claim that this study is making on the importance of populist mobilization. I mean, I think there are two major claims that the study is making. On the importance of populist mobilization. I mean, the recent sort of literature that has now emerged post 2008 and the sort of the rise of populist mobilization in Western liberal democracies, both in Europe, North America, and so on. I mean, that literature tends to sort of look at populism mainly as a distortion, a corruption of liberal democracy. And people like Partha Chatterjee, I mean, the 2018 or 19, I mean, the lectures happened in 2018, I think, and the book, I am the people. So, I mean, that kind of, tries to sort of make an argument about how to understand the current waves of sort of populist mobilization and populist capture of political power in the West, with reference to the longer sort of experience of of populist mobilization in the post-colony. And, the Indian example sort of being crucial, going back to Mrs. Gandhi and so on, and so on and so forth. So, and it's actually sort of quite telling that, that sort of work at the cutting edge seems to, there's such a strong connection, and there's such a strong sort of link in the way, this study is moving, and with respect to the insights that, are now sort of becoming relevant on a sort of, global international, level of understanding the trajectories of liberal democracy. I find that sort of, the conviction and the clarity with which the study actually moves forward in its forefronting of populist mobilization as a distinct political logic, right? I mean, it's not seen as a corruption or a distortion that, is largely sort of characterized as being anti-pluralist, anti-elitist, and so on and so forth, but it's recognized as being a distinct kind of political logic that is capable of producing better developmental outcomes, right? So I think that's one major strong claim that this work is making. And I mean, from Kalai's presentation, it's obvious that, that has been sort of substantiated with, a very wide-ranging, comprehensive marshalling of data from diverse sort of secondary sources, fieldwork, and so on and so forth. And the second claim I think that the work is actually making is to do with again, the fact that, if policy design and development strategies are embedded in the cultural form, in a specific cultural formation, that again enhances the possibility of better outcomes, of better democratic outcomes. This is at one level, really turning its back on, what has been a core belief of development economics, I think, and its sort of intrinsic and inherent sort of validation of the modernization thesis, right? So, in sort of stepping away from this one model fits all and sort of explains all development trajectories to a forefronting and a sort of upfront claim and argument that development strategies embedded in a cultural formation have the possibility of better outcomes. right? I mean, so I think these two strong claims within the book is sort of, and the conviction and the clarity with which they have been sort of put forth, and to find two economists sort of finding the resources in a political theorist like Laclau, and working from the level of the empirical to explain the empirical through the use of theory, right? I mean, the understanding that economic theory sort of gives you a model, which then needs to sort of, I mean, you need to actually see to what extent, I mean, your data diverges from that. I mean, there is a lot of sort of, contortion, I mean, contorted arguments that go on in a lot of sort of mainstream economics sort of work. And the relationship between sort of theory as something a priori, given, and I mean, the design of policy as an application, right? I mean, that binary between theory and application, I think is nicely sort of done away with in the present work. Right? I mean, there is an attempt to sort of look at the sort of historical trajectory of development. So this attempt to sort of actually historicize and contextualize policy initiatives, policy design, in sort of the imperatives of political mobilization in the region, right? And moving forward from there on, I think that is truly valuable. Such efforts at contextually locating and historicizing the development discourse and economic policy choices in Tamil Nadu, emerging from within the discipline of economics, seems at one level a truly astounding feat of methodological unorthodoxy. The observations of, I mean, here I'm reminded of the observations of, several sort of renowned economists, including the labor economist Deepak Nair, who has sort of written about the, how the intersection between macroeconomics and human development had diminished in recent decades, as the concerns of macroeconomics have become narrower, with the focus, shifting from full employment to price stability, from growth to equilibrium, and from the real economy to the financial sector. So when a lot of mainstream economics work has now become narrower and narrower in focus, the range of sort of domains traversed by a study like this to actually sort of make an argument about the nature of mobilization, where the momentum is coming from. I mean, that I think is quite extraordinary. I'll just end by, I mean, if this is the analysis of sort of the development, the specificity of the development trajectory is one part of what, I mean, this work has allowed us to sort of see with such clarity. Clearly there are implications from this to how we think about what it means to analyze policy, right? I mean, the implications for policy analysis. There's I think people from other disciplines who are beginning to sort of wonder the implications and the repercussions of this sort of exclusive relation between development economics and the terrain of policy analysis. I mean, traditionally there have been sort of inputs or views on policy analysis from other disciplines too. But I think, I mean, over time and over the decades, thinking about policy within the other social science disciplines is regarded as something of a stigmatized activity, right? And leaving policy analysis entirely to development economics and development economists, I think has had sort of serious implications for how we understand the relation between our social sciences and policy discourse and policy analysis and the formulation of policy. There are sort of continuities there, I think, which can begin to sort of be uncovered. I mean, if the assumptions of the subdiscipline of development economics in looking at specific trajectories in historically sort of embedded ways. I mean, if that sort of is advanced, I think it also opens up the field of, policy analysis. So I'll end there. I have questions for Kalai and comments about, I mean, what he was saying about labor reform and security for informal workers. But I think it's time we opened up the discussion, and if there's an opportunity, I'll sort of come in to make my observations.
Thank you. Please let us know if those who are online want to ask questions, or and please raise your hand or send us a message in the chat box. But we'll take the questions after. Okay.
Thanks, Kalai. That was really very comprehensive and interesting. Particularly interesting for me because my initial work has been on Himachal. And so I have to though say that, I mean, I was a little bit surprised to see you put Himachal on the negative on the growth side, because in fact, it has amongst the higher per capita incomes, it also has one of the best records in land reform. So it's, it is actually in many ways similar to the model that you're describing, where it has, it also has, I don't know if you're familiar with Prerna Singh's work, because she's also looked at subnational identities, regional identities. And so the Pahadi identity there also has contributed greatly to, so I completely, and in that sense, I agree that, identity, sub-national or regional identities do seem to matter in the kind of trajectories we are seeing of development. I'm just wondering, the Dravidian identity that you refer to, is it based on what? Is it language, culture, just the, regional? What is the sense that what is common in that idea? And also whether the, political or the popular mobilization that you talk about, is it based on that common identity? And what is the mechanism by which that actually translates into this particular development model? For instance, if I was to think of other political mobilizations, caste mobilizations, like in UP, for instance, that has given rise to very different kind of, in fact, it hasn't given rise to the kind of welfarist model that is described here. And so I'm also wondering what role leadership has to play in that, and whether you have at all referred to that in any form. And then eventually, I mean, this idea of embedding development within a kind of common cultural, ground, so to speak, is in some senses contrary to more democratic. So, I'm just wondering, were there institutional processes, whether it was local government, etc., which enabled that within the cultural, or whether, what were the kind of the junctures there? Sorry, I have actually many more things, but later on.
Thank you, Veena, and certainly very, very rich summary of the book, and better than, in fact, way that I look at this, and particularly of the question of populism and its link with modernization and link with developmental outcomes. And this is actually the question. I think we look at in this broadly. I would summarize that into say two ways. One is this: what we see is populism now is emerging across the world, particularly rise of what you call authoritarian regimes, which also populist in many ways, well documented again by political scientists, which I would try to call as a right-wing populism, so to say. It's very exclusion and in fact return of the elite coming from different way. Whereas this experience may be designed or called as a left-wing populism in the original sense Laclau used, where you mobilize the diverse identities with a certain unified framework. With through that process, actually the subalterns get better off with that. The certain positive development happens on the ground, particularly to those who are at the bottom. So that way, it is one can think of as a right left wing in a broader sense. But of course, it need not be the one format that evolved in, say, or even Laclau trying to frame it in the Latin American context, but can also think of the different forms it takes. But of course, all populism has its own limitations. The left-wing populism has its own limitations, particularly excluding the elite. Sometimes even if this binary of the elite versus non-elite can also have can deepen over a time. I think that risk is there, but that is actually again is a product of political labor. How much that political labor allows to make it more as an exclusive, or how much political labor allows to reinvent constantly to include those who are excluded. Also, there's a risk of elite capture within. I mean, you bring us diverse groups, and there could be one group actually takes advantage of that unifying logic in its favor and at the expense of others within that political domain of the popular. Here is a popular of the subaltern in that sense. So left-wing populism too has its own risk of producing, which actually see in Tamil Nadu context too, that there are some caste groups actually take advantage of this resources or this mobilization in their favor at the expense of others. So that risk always there. It again lies with the political labor and the political parties which try to represent this to constantly rework and to make that inclusion happens. That again, is a product of range of conjectures one can think. So coming back to this question, of course, the Haryana case, I mean, I meant definitely it has a potential. I completely agree with this. One thing we thought of doing is manufacturing as a base. Of course, even Haryana do have a lot of pharmaceutical companies, but even that was actually main understanding of ours as a growth. But definitely we have to take into account. But question of identity, Dravidian, what do you mean by that? It's a very important question because I did not define it well while I was introducing, my initial input. So definitely we did not use that because it's a very contested word. It's like whether it is a cultural, whether it is a language, whether it is a territorial. No, and also the source of this idea of the Dravidian also came from diverse roots. Even if in the book itself, we could see almost 4 or 5 sources. One is definitely there is a Dalit intellectual who came in the late 19th century, actually developed this idea. In fact, the Dravidian goes to Ayodhya Dasar, and actually they have a certain imagination of it. And of course, there is a missionary role, and there is a other Saivite route, and there is different diverse route. So, and as a different meaning, different meaning they attach to all of those words as a word Dravidian. So what we identify as a Dravidian, how that is linked to the developmental discourse. Here we are directly connecting that word with the developmental question here. We identified the Dravidian as in fact, quoting again from the Periyar, again his own, and also the other social scientists, M.S.S. Pandian, actually has derived in a particular way of it. I think both from that clearly emerges one trend, which the trend I think is closer to the understanding that we have of the word. The word is essentially, Periyar uses the word as anyone believes in equality. He calls as even he goes to the extent, if some Japanese comes and attacks the caste here and stands with me in ensuring equality, he is also Dravidian. So that Dravidian is an open-ended. So in the sense, it is an idea. Of course, the idea actually rooted in that particular culture. The resource of that idea come from that particular culture, but it need not be very exclusive. But it has a potential to become exclusive by the practitioner. But there is one strand of thought which actually allowed that to be more open-ended, porous in that it is not exclusive by culture, race, and thing. It is an idea, which clearly defines that nobody is above me, nobody is below me, and we stand by this. So that actually allows some way, because many of the leaders also come from diverse background, so could definitely be called as exclusive in one way or other. You're not authentic. The question of authentic comes, then nobody would fit in that, fill that, or qualify for that. So that's an idea. So why that is important, again, of the building this political coalition or the political labor, you need an identity to bring people together. And again, we all know in political science literature, in the public goods, in a divided society, it became very difficult. You have to build a consensus to get even, allocate certain budgetary resources on certain things. There's a well-documented work why Tamil Nadu went to pro-poor policy in certain things as compared to Karnataka. There's a political thesis by Narayan Lakshman in LC thesis, became a book, Pattern of Poor, which clearly says that there is a particular coalition in Karnataka actually put a more emphasis on irrigation because certain caste background to it, and less emphasis on the public goods or the health and education, or even in the pro-poor. Whereas in Tamil Nadu case, it's a multi-coalition again, the multi-caste coalition and broader base coming from diverse sources, particularly from the below. And in fact, it actually put forth certain pro-poor policy. It's electoral compulsion, and also allowed this historical narrative that I'm giving that actually allowed that possibilities. So that definitely there's both Dravidian here. It's an open-ended, we say. In that sense, it is exclusive. It can become exclusive, but it still has theoretically has a potential to become even. That's what I would think of even today. Migrant labor. This could be possible tomorrow if the regional uneven growth that is happening now, deepening degree of wage differences between the regions and even the standard of living. Obviously, there'll be an in-migration that's going to generate a problem. But I would think of even the migrants irrespective of the background, that one ideally should be part of this developmental, that sense, given this logic goes in. So again, that lies with the political labor. How much is the political parties and political leaders allow that to be inclusive in that sense? So leadership definitely plays a role, but I think leadership is still bounded in that sense of the history, that this mobilization, that they can operate only within that. I mean, of course, there is innovation happening there of the senior stars becoming senior leaders, and they articulating certain concerns and identifying certain welfare. But I think all of that are to operate. If you look at the history, they were all operating within this mobilization. That actually is a distinct from what we see in UP and VR in particular, because they also had a similar concern with the social question, caste discrimination. I just given another recent work. It's by Amit Aguja. It's called Mobilizing Poor. It's again PhD thesis from University of California from Wright. They map these two regions of the two kind of caste mobilization, South versus North. And they say, look at here is what happened as a mobilization largely confined to the electoral level of getting the representation in the political or even some extent in the bureaucratic or state structure institutions, but did not translate in a way that it translated in the South, or even certain extent in Maharashtra, that sense. It is a social mobilization coming in, translating into an electoral thing that actually institutionalizing certain policies. So that kind of transition, that kind of broad basing was not taking place in the other cases. So again, if this is in a limited sense, whether this identity, this mobilization, this institution has its own inherent limits. Of course, there are sections within this identity gained more than others in terms of caste. That risk is still there, but still it delivered in some extent, in a large extent. That's with a limited claim that I'm making. Yeah, you have some, sorry.
We'll take another round of questions. So starting with Hugo, and then we have an online participant who has raised his or her hand.
Okay, thank you very much. So I had two questions. The first question, also at the beginning in the introduction, your graph with the different growth versus development also caught my attention. And I know we won't have time to compare the Dravidian model with every state in India, but specifically, I would be curious to have your insight on the comparison between the Dravidian model and Bengal. Because you mentioned the strength of unions, you mentioned the land reform. So I would be very curious to know how Bengal positions itself regarding all of that. And my second question is much broader. Now your book has almost 1 year, if I understand correctly, and people have been talking a lot about it. So you must have received also critics or contradictions. And I would be curious to know which comments that you receive caught your attention and maybe helps you to refine your theory or maybe take a different direction with your research. I would be just curious about that.
Thank you, Hugo. So we have a question. Can you?
Can I ask?
You can ask your question, Lipika.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Kalyaraisan, for this wonderful book. Really, it's very useful for my PhD. I'm working on my PhD. So I'm working on Tamil nationalism. So I'd be really happy if you could answer this question for me. That is, like, in Tamil Nadu, caste functions as a social network generally, like in accessing political power, economic well-being, or whatsoever. So this has created a virulent form of casteism in Tamil Nadu. So which is going against the Periyar's view or any social reformers view in Tamil Nadu. So this has also led to a decline in capacity to aspire. So recently, the ASCR report has even come out with a report saying that Tamil Nadu's level of learning is declining and their way of enrollment is also declining. So do you think, have we reached the peak? Have we reached the peak of the Dravidian model, and are we in the declining phase of the Dravidian model? So if it would be really helpful if you could answer this. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the book. It's really useful.
Thank you, Lipika. In fact, if any other question, Professor Kundu.
I've been always very impressed by your analytical capability of analyzing a problem, go deeper, looking at different perspectives. But today what you did is important, that you are really trying to explore the possibilities of generalizing, taking these experiences that we have in a regional context, how it can be, have a larger perspective. I must admit, I had not come across the term Dravidian model before I started reading your book that you gifted to me before a few months. And I must tell you, when I looked at it, I found the issues that you're raising have been there. For example, not talking about Sen Bhagwati debate, more recently, after ADB brought out the report that 21st century belongs to Asia. You have to just realize the possibilities. It belongs to India. Montek Singh Ahluwalia and Sen had a discussion, and Sen was arguing on education and health, saying that no country has grown for 30, 40 years without making investment in education and health, whereas Montek Singh was saying economic infrastructure. Look at Bihar, look at UP, Chhattisgarh, and unless you provide the economic infrastructure, banking, road, power. And the question that was raised is that if you just give education and health at the macro level, at the state level, does it really reach all sections of the society? That is the question that you're raising through this. On the other hand, I'm talking about another discourse which has been there, is the study, long time back, we did at Jawaharlal Nehru University, studying the institutional factors at the ground level, Batala and Moga. After that, we took Tirchungodu, you remember, in which Christoph was also part. We tried to find out, we really didn't look at educational level or health level, but we were trying to find out what are the institutional mechanisms which makes these small towns click and take them to the national level. For example, Batala or Moga producing 70-80% of these machines. Similarly, rig industry in Tirchungodu, in Mandi Govindgarh secondary steel processing. Is it the global market? No. In fact, the book that came up from Doni Vidal and Marie-Hélène Zera talks about the subaltern urbanization. talks about at least 20 cases where things have happened because of the institutional factor, caste factor, cultural factor, historical factor, some accidental factor, some highway going past, or some large city having some linkage. So that debate is also going on, that social, cultural factors must be brought in. Just don't bring in education and health and banking, but you have to understand the context. And the argument that came in this book, Subaltern Urbanization, that besides the dominant model of globalization, promoting urbanization and industrialization in India, you have to look at socio-cultural factors. What I like about this book, when you call it a Dravidian model, because you're really bringing these two things together. You are saying, yes, infrastructure, education, health, but unless you understand the society, the power structure, the economic inequality, social inequality, you just can't put in the two big infrastructural factors and hope that everything will be smooth, as you have said, that, power relation also come in, the wages also improve, then there are labor unions and the state also intervene. That kind of an idealism, I think you're exploring it, that to what extent what happened in two states can be really taken up. I just make one point in condition with that, and I'll stop. Towards the end of your presentation, you raised questions about inequalities coming up in certain manner, and that is what is disturbing me. When you talk about taking this model to a higher level and generalize at the national level, what kind of disturbing inequality trends do you find? The data from National Sample Survey 2017-18 shows that you're right, primary education was brought in Kerala, Tamil Nadu. Today, if you look at the state level data, all the backward states have 98%, 97% enrollment in primary education. But look at the per capita expenditure. It varies from 30 rupees to 1,80,000 rupees per person per month. That is something very disturbing. Quality of education. And as a result of that, you find the states like, Uttarakhand, education coming up, but it is sharp inequality. It is not inclusive development. That is what is worrying. I just want to mention that you talked about Tamil Nadu. There are some problems coming up at a much higher share of manufacturing sector in state GDP. But we know Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, they are having much lower share in industries, and that is also going down. So I'm saying premature deindustrialization. This is Danny Rodriguez. If some of the backward states which are trying to promote education and health, if it is not bringing inclusivity, then their industrialization might have serious problems. You might export the uncertainties from the global market. That is what I would like you to talk about, that how do you think that these emerging inequalities can be dealt with so that a smooth, inclusive urban industrial development can take place? Sorry, I took a little more time than I should have.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, I'll start from the last questions, which are very challenging for me to answer. Certainly, I'm sure. So definitely of the case studies, like a macro of the divide between economic infrastructure versus social infrastructure, that translates into debate between Sen versus Bhagwati. Now it's Ahluwalia versus Sen again. That actually somewhere it's somewhere of the pattern that comes from there. But that matters. Definitely, I think we need to go into the specific in the region, specific local institutional factors. This is something it also emerged in my own interaction. If you go and ask Tirupur, I did some field work in Tirupur. Tirupur has been a successful case in terms of entrepreneurship coming from, say, peasantry route of I would call as a transition. Tiruchendur route is I call as an artisan route of transition, because small artisan, building small thing, then becoming a rig industry, then becoming scaling it up and connecting even to the not global market, but extend outside of the state is going up. So there's a scaling up happening, but that is really coming from the local. If I ask all of them, what is the state contribution? Tamil Nadu or the state contribution, state intervention towards it? None of them said, no, we all self-made. The state did nothing to us. But similarly, with Tirupur, say, state did nothing to us. We all it's our own effort, our own toil, our own thing. But actually not true. If you look at the kind of intervention happened in terms of road connectivity, how do you actually transport your goods? road connectivity, transport, and if you look at some measure of the density, it is nowhere comparable to any other. If that none of them was there, economic infrastructure was not there, that transition would have not taken place. But many would not say that. Acknowledge. Maybe the well-informed, those who are part of the academic debate would say, yes, this all happened, therefore we could do this. So about local factor plays. The second aspect again of the health and education too. Of course, all of these guys could go to, even if even the subaltern urbanization, there's a lot of accounts of the ethnographic accounts of the entrepreneurs coming from background, and the education that they acquired, and that facilitated some of them to scale it up. So definitely this provision of education and health and provision of the economic infrastructures together provided, maybe call as provided an ecosystem or a system or maybe a context. But again, that further requires the regional specific of the local dynamics of caste class. That also needs to be taken into account to really understand. So even the urbanization indicators in that book, again, coming from, that's what I'm quoting from, it's much more broad-based, because Tiruchendur is a small town. It's not really coming from, say, for example, if you take the other state, you'll have 3 towns, 2 towns, take a Maharashtra. You'll have either Pune or Bombay in terms of the big towns to driving the growth. But in Tamil Nadu case, you'll go even the Tiruchendur or Tirupur or small region would come. That precisely came because of the macro level state intervention happened, both in terms of economic infrastructure as well as the social thing that were provided the base on which these local communities build that. But the local communities are again exclusive here. That is where the question connected to the one who asked me there, the caste network, which seen many, actually, there's a theory now emerging within social science, particularly interdisciplinary, again, celebrating caste as a social capital, because some communities are able to mobilize the resources or even exploit the state resources or pool resources among the caste community, their own caste members, and therefore that is a successful model. No, that cannot be successful, because successful for that community, perhaps few elites within that communities, but it is again very unevenly distributed. The caste network of the all caste net, it's not randomly distributed in that sense. It is the density of the network actually varies based on the caste location. If someone says the caste is a way of mobility, because there are, I see the theorists celebrating caste is a good thing, because it in fact is an insurance without paying the premium. You provide resources within communities, you get a resources support through which one can, no, does not happen. That happens only for few, and within that caste, it is unevenly distributed. So therefore, here is a case we are saying in some way that actually that risk is there in Tamil Nadu too. That is exactly someone was asking question from online for a name. So definitely that risk is there. And future, again, that is connected to the quality of outcomes, which I find is the major challenge now. Because if you look at 50% is the GER in Tamil Nadu, which in fact, if you look at the national education policy, they want to achieve after 10 years or 15 years. That is their target. The national education policy of the target is, we want to achieve the 50% GER. Already Tamil Nadu is 51% GER. So problem is not as a quantitative. All 18 to 23, if you look at the age group, the substantial numbers are, in fact, more women are there. Question is now is what is the pathways of the transition, pathways to the labor market, and that is decided by the quality of learning in school level. That is decided kind of college you go, that decides the kind of job market you go. The new inequality, even if you look at the global level, it's not about India again. Even if you take the inequality report by Piketty's institution, Thomas Piketty brings this every year. Institution. One of the driver of inequality globally, most of the countries, is the education. Education, again, you can think of the quality of education, particularly college education, as a higher return of for the factors than the non-college going, which is the drivers. But India too, that driver will happen. But one more qualification here is not all colleges are similar. Again, there's a clear barrier would create divided. That divide again would come from caste and economic background. Again, large caste also would that come in. So we need to ensure this. I don't know what is the method test. Maybe is it so far our policies have evolved to ensure a degree of even national level, not in Tamil Nadu alone, even other states or reservation policies, other policies are allowed to ensure a degree of entry into the colleges or quantitative access, but does not guarantee that outcome is very. And relatively equal. We cannot ensure the outcome is equal. That would be like, you need imposing it, but at least ensure your institutional intermediaries or the ecosystem such that the kids or the school students who go through this process has a relatively better equitable outcome in learning and even in the higher education. So this has to happen from qualitative target oriented to quantitative target oriented to the qualitative. More of that requires not just level of, I'm sure there's a many have to think through collectively as to what are the institutional support required to ensure. And also this degree of social acceptance, social norm actually also is very serious important, because look at the higher education institutions are, being really exclusive, and the caste is becoming important site of politics now. Suicide, we tend to give the suicide rates, and which we guaranteed opportunity. And many actually from the first generation wanted to enter with this policies, and you don't have an ecosystem or institutional structure to protect and give the, realize the dream. In fact, killing, if someone takes a life off in higher education, it's killing a life, killing a dream in a way, right? So that actually is partly associated with this quality factor. I think the shift has to move essentially from quality to quantity. That is the main source of, I would think, of today's inequality, source of inequality. I would think of earlier your paper of urbanizing poverty. When the transition takes place, you push poor worker from, say, urban non-farm laborer, farm laborer to the informal worker in the urban. That generates a new inequality, rise of inequality in urban, rise of poverty in urban is explained by this. We can think of now shifting inequality from rural to urban, or from school education, other means, through different domain or different way of informality. That one can think of. Others, yeah, that's, I think,
You had other questions?
Yeah, other two questions. Yeah. So this is Bengal. Yeah, Bengal, I think it's very complex. It's very detailed. I mean, I also have one paper on, in fact, comparing the developmental regimes of Bengal with Tamil Nadu in that sense, because Bengal also historically came with the promise of broad basing. If you use, this is typologies political scientists make based on the sources of power and state level political regime. They call as a pro-poor and middle caste and a different. So Bengal also would perfectly fall under pro-poor source of power. I mean, pro-poor regimes, taken its social base, and did relative degree of particularly land reform, but its intervention in education and social sector is very poor. And also there is no, I mean, I'm inclined to believe some of the political scientists have come out with heavily on the states to say it is not even the lack of resources that prevented making inroads into education and health. Had they made intervention in health and education, the productivity raise or the gain that came through the land reform, they would have had, in fact, facilitated, better of it. In the sense, exploited the opportunities. If there was a simultaneous intervention in one level in the land reform, another level in the education health. The education health, the clear neglect has been seen as one of the factor of not exploiting the opportunities opened up by in the domain of the land reform. That clearly, and also cannot be explained by the resource crunch alone. People say it is political scientists, some of them, as to real failure of the imagination that the left had in that sense. We can, that is very contested domain, but I go with certain evidence for a certain political scientist. I can quote them, and it is not my words. It's from definitely their understanding words. Clearly that neglect, I would say. As a result, we see clearly the poor outcome in that sense. But now things are changing there too. Now, again, if you look at the educational outcome and enrollment ratios, all are picking up now there too, as in other states. And the Dravidian model, as much it's celebrated, has been definitely, I think I reserve it for our private conversation. I'll tell you long stories as to what all happened, and, whether, stooges of this from, it can go to, we can think of as, extremes. So, yeah, we will discuss about that.
You read it?
So can someone read? Maybe I'll explain. I'll try.
I
Yeah,
can.
she's asking. Is it when I say embedded labor worked in Tamil Nadu context, embedded labor being here is culturally supported because the intervention, as I mentioned, what is the argument there? The union density one level, definitely it had a union density. In addition to the union density, there's also a response from the state. That response was acquired from the state or from the politicians also through this non-economic mobilization, the connection that the workers had with the outside site of the factory, with the local, in the sense, so for example, if the strike happens, the strike does not happen only in the factory. If factory strike goes 2 days, there will be a strike on the road. Road will be blocked. So if the road gets blocked, obviously the local politician has to respond. So that naturally goes to the assembly to further. So at least the voice of the workers doesn't confine to the factory. It reaches to the wider state. So that kind of mechanism was possible because of historical reason and embeddedness of the labor. But would that be the same if the migrant comes into the picture? Which it is emerging now. I am yet to make a clear argument on this, but clearly we see that may not be the case with the migrant labor. The state may not be responding the interest of migrants as much as it is responding to the interest of what you call the worker from the local, which yet to be seen. And I do see whatever preliminary findings, preliminary report that I see in the newspaper, I clearly say that there's a differential. So that could also be the reason in Haryana case, but Haryana case, migrant labor alone is not responding. Even otherwise also, the distinction between the factory as a site of protest or as a site of bargaining, a site of contestation, and the outside is neatly disconnected. No politicians actually intervene in the factory problems in that sense. Here, this is a compulsion. The workers make the parties to respond to. You have to take a call. You have to take a position, being forced to take a position. And obviously there, even if you want to side with the capital, but for electoral reasons, you are pushed to take basically, I would say, certain degree of accountability that, put on the politicians to respond to, not at the benevolence of the politicians in that sense.
I'm sorry, we are a little bit running out of time, so I would like you to take the last question. It's from Rajesh, who is asking whether it's about the coastal belt, whether it has paid a very high price in terms of dispossession among fisher people, community, and agriculturists. So that would be, some kind of regional penalty for that part of Tamil Nadu.
Well, let's keep to make a specific observation on fishermen question. But whatever this recent report, I think one of the MIDS faculty was part of that report, making the report, making that part of the study, and the report is out, which clearly suggests that of the cost of development. In that sense, obviously the disposition of the fishermen, and it was Tamil Nadu also one of the pioneer in that sense, mechanization of the fishing. In that sense, blue, they call us a blue revolution. But I would still say that the welfare architect still played a role of containing that. One can think of that as a supporting the fisherman. Also, one can think of as a containing the discontent that emerged from the disposition. But the agriculture, which is very clear, as I mean, this Danny Roderick, this is, I think, the modernization theory of the global. I've learned to contend with the global South in particular, which aspires to even industrialize, transform. Tamil Nadu transformation actually, some ways, shows the limits of that, the imagination that we have on the modernization or the emphasis on industrialization. To what extent, even if you broad base limited way, now it's Tamil Nadu, what, 20%, 22% of the manufacturing. Even if you extend, but it's not equivalent to, say, China 40 plus, or the South Korea or other Southeast Asian countries. But if given this, how much it's possible to observe labor or people who are dispossessed from the traditional, dismembered from agriculture to get into modern industry. So if not, then what is the solution to that? Is a question. I think it's not, I mean, it clearly emerges from Tamil Nadu. I think it's not confined to, I think I would attribute that question to the inability of the state to absorb people who are dispossessed from agriculture fully into modern is the larger question that we all have to contend. In fact, that is precisely why the right-wing, I mean, populism that is emerging even in the Western world, which is the new forms of duality or new forms of dispersion that is emerging in the even the Western part of like there's a line of studies to suggest it happening in other part of world. So Tamil Nadu is no exception to that trend. That clearly shows there's a limits. Whether how much that limits can be resolved at the subnational scale, given now of the power that already has been shrinking. Second, even the global way it is connected to. That is, again, go back to the Danny Roderick theory of premature deindustrialization.
Just one thing. They say large percentage of the migrants in Punjab and Haryana are from Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh, right? And same case for Tamil Nadu and Kerala also. And the percentage of share of migrants from these three states into Tamil Nadu and Kerala has gone up. But if you look at the organization of the migrants, it's much better in southern states. You know, they have their wage differential. If you look at the PLFS data, you do find that the wage differences are much higher. And in many of the northern states during the period of COVID, they passed resolution in Haryana particularly that you cannot employ people from other states at the D level. So there is a discriminatory policy coming up in the northern states, which is not yet there in the southern states.
The sort of question of present, just a very quick observation. Reservations, the demand for reservation by sort of elite castes in Maharashtra, Jat reservations. Similar demands have not arisen of course, the question of the Dalit is sort of, clearly sort of, very stark now. But they're all asking for reservation. Right. And the Marathas are asking for Yeah, and the Marathas in Maharashtra are asking for reservation, and at the same time asking for a repeal of the Prevention of Atrocities Act. So they want to sort of stake their claim as so it's the sort of undoing of Maratha hegemony.
Okay, thank you. So thank you to all of you. And so to close with the comments, not from you, but from Professor Kundu, from Kiran, and from Veena. It was really a great and lively seminar. So thank you once again, Kale. And again, congrats for your book.
Thank you.
Goodbye to everyone.